To those who may be listening who believe the free market alone can solve all problems without any redistribution or environmental regulation, do you want kings? Because that's how you get kings. Welcome to a special episode of the Environment in Canada podcast about our new sub-series we will be running on some Saturdays. We're calling this new sub-series Sovereignty Saturdays, and the common theme to these episodes will be a focus on countering attempts by the US government to annex Canada with an environmental lens. Last week's episode covered how emerging authoritarianism in the US poses a huge risk for Canada, because the same people talking about the enemy within, south of the border, also believe Canada should be part of the United States. We discussed what you can do to act now to counter that, so please go back and check out that episode if you haven't already. Today, however, is No King's Day in the US, and there are some events taking place in Canada too. Our sister organization, the US Sierra Club, is partnering on No Kings. Meanwhile, Sierra Club Canada, that's us, have been helping to run many versus the money events in Atlantic Canada, focusing on retaking our power as communities from billionaires. And so it seems like a good time to maybe go over a few deep-rooted issues that you've probably spent some time thinking about, and I know I have. Because underneath everything, we are seeing there are some deeply ridiculous assumptions, some premises that we've been told to internalize. These false assumptions include the notions that when we deregulate everything, let corporations do what they want, the environment, fail to tax oil and gas corporations, and give unlimited power to billionaires, that somehow all that will work out in the common good, that the environment can continue to support us under these circumstances, and that democracy can survive under those circumstances. All of these premises are, on their face, ridiculous. If you don't believe me, and for some reason subscribe to this podcast, then welcome, and I hope you get something out of this. But really think about it for a moment. We know that with extreme wealth comes immense influence. Anyone who has ever dealt with the influence of oil and gas corporations knows this. Large portions of our media, both social media and journalistic media, are owned by billionaires. We live in economies where one person can literally amass hundreds of thousands of times the wealth of the average person. How on earth is democracy supposed to survive in that system, with that sort of imbalance? It's just silly to believe that democracy as a system and that sort of individual power are compatible. Even if 90% of billionaires were well-meaning, it would only take one to start moving things in an authoritarian direction. And extreme wealth itself isn't good for a person. It distorts reality not only just for the rest of us, but for the billionaire themselves. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The entire premise of democracy is that there has to be a balance of power between people, because no one person or small group should be trusted with too much power. That power corrupts is the premise there. What's happening in the US right now, with the consolidation of power in the hands of a few rich people, an oligarchy, is the result of the founding fathers of the US failing to understand where kings come from on a more fundamental level. Kings come to power, whether by the sword or by the market, by accumulating wealth and with it influence. Kings become kings because they gain a monopoly on ownership, on communications, or close enough to one that they can rule alongside a wealthy aristocracy. This problem, this failure of democratic systems to deal with this core issue is not unique to the United States, but it's one we're seeing around the world. Everywhere, people are told to blame themselves or others for the crises we face, even though we now know individual actions were never going to be the deciding factor in crises like climate change. As Oxfam reports, in 2019, the richest 1% produced the same greenhouse gas emissions in 2019 as the world's 5 billion poorest people, or 66% of the global population. In Canada, the richest 1% produced 150 tons of carbon pollution per person compared to just 5.2 tons for the poorest 50%. In short, you and I and the people from or in other countries that we've repeatedly been told to blame for what's happening in terms of the climate crisis, we're never to blame for our inability to deal with the climate crisis. As the climate and biodiversity crises get worse, as regulations meant to stop those crises are increasingly eroded, authoritarians are going to keep trying to make the most of those crises to consolidate power by turning us against each other. Oil and gas corporations are going to try to make as much profit as possible too. It's no wonder that when we talk about mobility in the economy, we are told by the wealthy to blame regulation. Indeed, corporate regulation, and especially environmental regulation, is constantly portrayed in Canadian media as a hindrance to our economic well-being when it is anything but. And here I want to quote Ol Hendrickson, who is the chair of our conservation committee at Circle Canada and who writes a regular column at rabble.ca. This is from his recent installment entitled Regulation Saves Money and Lives. I'll link to that article below the podcast. Deregulation overall paves the way for closed-door backroom deals between politicians and developers, crony capitalism. Too many people believe that by getting rid of regulations, we can unleash economic growth. In actuality, deregulation is a big part of why Canada's productivity is lagging behind other nations. Conversely, smart regulation spurs innovation, competition, and investment, creates jobs, and saves money. Here's a theoretical example that Ol uses to illustrate this in his article. Suppose that government commissions an in-depth study of laundry detergents with a view towards possible new regulations. The technical team quickly concludes that most detergents contain unnecessary fragrances, dyes, and other chemical substances that cause cancer, allergic reactions, respiratory problems, and are toxic to aquatic organisms. They identify laundry detergent jugs as a major source of plastic waste and show that transporting liquid detergents consumes far more energy than powdered detergents, aggravating climate change. Importantly, they also compare how clean your clothes will get with powdered versus liquid detergents. They find that powders work better for most household uses, such as mud and grass stains, but liquids are needed for limited applications such as greasy work clothes. They note that powders have virtually disappeared in North America but dominate globally. They recommend that liquids should make up at most 20% of the detergent market. The government decides to act. It implements a phase down of liquid detergents and plastic detergent jugs to 20% of total sales over a 2-year period, and a phase out of all toxic substances in detergents. If companies don't meet these regulations, they are subjected to heavy fines. What happens next? A few small companies that are still in the powder detergent business expand and flourish. Competition increases. Big companies scramble to retake market share. They retool to replace liquids with powders, investing in new equipment and creating new manufacturing jobs. It turns out that shipping powders in cardboard containers costs considerably less than shipping liquids in jugs. Consumer costs go down. Most importantly, over the long term, the health of people, fish, and other aquatic organisms improves because of their reduced exposure to toxic chemicals. This almost sounds too simple, like fantasy, but consider this. When the big entrenched corporations and their multimillionaire owners and managers are fighting against regulations, they are simply trying to entrench the status quo, their fat salaries, mainly. They are fighting change, too often with the help of politicians. As I say, I recommend reading Ol's full article on the subject, which is linked below. But what's even more ironic, I would argue, is that the free market itself becomes its own victim if left unchecked by regulation and redistribution. There's that saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, there's no such thing as an economy without regulation either. The only question is, who controls that regulation? The many or the few with the money? You can't entirely blame people for thinking government isn't the answer here. After all, the Canadian government gives huge subsidies to oil and gas corporations while underfunding key services. Bureaucracy can itself be captured by wealthy interests. There are good books worth reading in this regard, like Dark Money by Jane Mayer and The Captured Economy. There's also the history of public relations as a field itself here, which has fine-tuned the capacity of corporations and the wealthy few to bend the market of ideas towards their ideas, to bend it to their communications and to their interests. But what I'd summarize here is that as wealth accumulates in the hands of the few, it starts to distort the very market that created it, ultimately to a point of autocratic ecological crises like the ones that we are facing right now. Let's look at this from an ecological, biological perspective, and I'm going to use a really ridiculous-sounding metaphor here because the truth is so ridiculous that the metaphor actually works. If we think of the market like an organism, then mass individual wealth is the organism's poop. It's not something that actually helps the organism survive, it's the waste product of competition. People compete, somebody wins, and if they keep winning at some point, they end up with more wealth than any one person could possibly use. The problem with pure free market thinking is it locks the animal in a closed room with an ever-increasing pile of poop, and no system to redistribute that poop so it could actually one day turn into food for the animal in the future. What I'm trying to say here is, left to its own devices, the free market will destroy itself by creating monopolies and singular wealthy individuals who can rig government and the market to their own ends, and environmental crises that undermine the very ecology on which that market rests, our environment. Personally, I think it's long past time democracy got an upgrade. And there are lots of people right now talking about some sort of limit on wealth. Patriotic millionaires, for example, people like Dr. Ingrid Robbins, to name just a couple of examples. Wherever you sit and whatever you think of their ideas, the question of how to deal with equality is getting more attention, and it's both telling and good that we are finally having louder conversations about it. I was part of the Occupy movement many years ago, and this conversation also feels different and more actionable than the ones I was having back then, which is encouraging. I think on some fundamental level, mass inequality has always been that issue that we all knew was inherently the big problem here, but which also always seemed too big to deal with. Sure, it's driven the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and the erosion of regulations that were helping to keep our planet livable, but as human beings, we always tend towards trying to fix the symptoms and not the cause. And here I've got to question another false premise, though, which I think is holding us back. Is mass inequality really that hard of a problem to solve? Or is it actually remarkably simple, and we've simply been putting it off like that laundry we said we'd do 5 days ago? If we all understand this problem exists on some inherent level, maybe part of the problem is in us overcomplicating the solution. For example, my mother, once upon a time when I was a kid, suggested simply capping wealth at a certain limit and literally dividing the excess wealth equally amongst everybody and giving it back directly to everybody as a share. It's a very Robin Hood-ish idea I've written about in an article I'll link below, which also has some research resources for quite a lot of what I've said here. After all, she grew up as a kid on the wrong side of the tracks and was told herself that she would never make it, so she understands this issue better than most people. What I like about my mother's concept is it's transparent and easy for people to understand, involves minimal bureaucracy, and therefore is durable in the face of the sort of billionaire-funded disinformation that has collapsed the redistribution measures of the past or misappropriated public funds through corporate subsidies. But whatever we try to do, whatever system we come up with to try and fix mass inequality and help heal our environment, we are going to need to do something. Because if we don't fix mass inequality, kings will always be the ultimate result. And that's the action item for this week. Get excited. Talk to others about your thoughts on how we deal with this issue of the many versus the money. Get excited about solutions and start to actually organize. Go out, talk to a few people about this topic and start talking about those solutions and start challenging those fundamental premises that, as I outlined today, have been holding us back this entire time. As we talked about before, the times that seem the most hopeless are also often the times when the greatest positive changes can start to take shape. What we may well see is a boomerang moment towards something better. But whether that happens is up to all of us working together, because no one else is coming to the rescue but us. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.